This is section 11, lecture 2. We're still talking about the media's role in U.S. foreign policy. One of the things that we've discussed earlier was the Ullmann-Lippmann consensus, where the public is largely uninformed and inattentive to foreign policy and foreign news. And this plays out in the U.S. media as well. The U.S. news tends to show only a greater concern for domestic programming. Television news contains only around 20% of international news stories. Of course, this goes up and down depending on the news cycle, but that is an average through many studies conducted. Print news, what is referred to here as the prestige press, covers foreign stories more, but still people don't necessarily, and increasingly during this day and age, people don't necessarily go to the newspaper or to other print media like news magazines. And so, for example, New York Times contains around 40% foreign stories, but that doesn't mean that people are seeking out the physical papers. Oftentimes, in the modern world, the internet is the main source of news. And of course, you can pick and choose what you want to see when it comes to internet stories. And that's where these two terms below come into play. If the public is largely inattentive, if the public is uninformed or misinformed, if the media shows a greater bias towards domestic programming, it's left up to people to seek out news for themselves, or seek out foreign policy news or foreign stories for themselves. But people don't necessarily do so in an even and balanced way. And this is where these two terms come in: selective perceptions and selective exposure. Selective perception is akin to the theories that we talked about earlier in the class on how policymakers may view incoming information. That selective bias, that they're only going to pick up on and believe things that already align with what they believe, their worldviews. And the same thing goes for the public's consumption of media. Political stories and foreign policy stories fall into this. And so people will seek out information that oftentimes reinforces their worldview and dismiss or ignore information that contradicts the way that they view the world, contradicts their preconceived notions, contradicts their beliefs, their political ideologies, so on and so forth. And we see this play out in newspapers, right? Conservatives tend to favor the Wall Street Journal over the New York Times, for example. We see this in television news as well. People sort of in their corners ideologically will watch either Fox News or MSNBC. And so the information, the opinions that they are receiving aren't necessarily fully informing them on foreign policy stories. They're really just reinforcing what they already think. Selective exposure is a similar idea. That you rely on that news that's going to conform to your pre-existing values or opinions, that you will seek out Fox News, that you will seek out MSNBC, that you will seek out a conservative magazine like the National Review, for example. And so then this reinforces the idea that we talked about earlier, that people are sometimes underinformed, uninformed about foreign policy stories. And one thing that's compounding this problem is the changing role of the media in a systemic way. The print media is slowly withering on the vine. Magazines have begun to go out of business. Those magazines like Newsweek, for example, no longer have print editions. They're only online editions. Well, that used to be an important source of foreign policy stories from time to time. And so the changes in technology have really changed how news is delivered, and it changes then what stories get through. If news is delivered via the internet or via television, what's going to get through then is going to be influenced by selective perception and selective exposure. Whereas in the past, you only had 3 television stations to choose from, and you could choose which newspapers to read, but many of them would have been based on straight news. Today, right, most people are going to get their news via the internet, which allows them to pick and choose stories at will. There's also been a change in who provides the news and how it is provided. And so then, foreign affairs, even though the numbers are relatively, or the percentages are relatively small of the coverage, that coverage has increased over time due to television access. It's much easier now for our cable news stations to break to ongoing stories around the world because they pick up on the media coverage of local television stations. And so if you're a cable news network filling 24 hours, you can, let's use the example, a recent example of an attempted coup in Turkey. Well, on CNN and on MSNBC, they showed the same video. Well, that's because that video came from Turkish television. And so to fill that time, to cover that story, they can, more easily do so by picking up on these television feeds. In some instances, having their own correspondence in that area of the world, even though that has decreased. You can still have pundits and professional opinionists make comments on these ongoing situations. One of the other influences of cable news and an increasing influence of television news is this idea of rooftop journalism. And this is where people are on the ground during these fast-paced changing events, interviewing locals, just sort of, in some instances, just setting up a television camera on a rooftop or in a hotel room balcony and filming what's going on in the streets. And you have an instance, this example here from during the first Gulf War during 1991, where the only 24-hour news station, CNN, during that time had constant coverage coming from Baghdad that was being bombed at the time. These news personnel that were well known to the CNN audience, sort of respected journalists, sat in their hotel room on the floor and pointed a camera out the window. And so we saw these flashing lights of bombs and anti-aircraft weaponry, and they just talked over it. Well, that's kind of what still happens, whether or not a journalist is on the ground in a specific area or not. The consequence of that constant coverage, the 24-hour news cycle, so on and so forth, and the ability to sort of set up a television camera and capture different things is referred to as the CNN effect. When you have coverage that is live, that is ongoing, that is happening at a rapid pace, this forces governments to respond. And governments, attempt to manipulate the media, attempt to spin, attempt to shape public opinion, but that constant coverage then leads to a loss of policy control, a loss of spin, a loss of the story, and sort of dominating the news from their perspective, the government's policy perspective, because of this constant coverage. That's the CNN effect. And so this breaking news constantly, or rooftop journalism, then limits the government's ability to pursue certain foreign policy actions, limits oftentimes the ability of the government not to act, because if something's getting constant coverage, if the media are setting the agenda by covering a story, then this is going to force policymakers to act or react. And in some ways that is going to diminish the power of government, but I have here that it can also enhance the power of the government, particularly the president, in using their bully pulpits to shape public opinion in reaction to an ongoing story. Here we have a representation of the media's changing role stemming from the discussion 2 slides earlier. There have been several changing factors that have influenced the media's role in covering foreign affairs. From print to video, sort of increasing reliance on television, now the increasing reliance on the internet. The rise of niche media, this includes professional opinionists and political pundits exposing or discussing controversial topics. One of the things that we mentioned earlier is that there is a U.S. centrism. There is conflict orientation, right? The media are going to seek out conflict and controversy. There is a superficiality, a lack of depth. And in some ways, there is an arbitrary nature to coverage based on a quick reaction and focusing on crises, focusing on conflict, rather than going into a long-term story. And so journalism has changed into covering the immediate story and away from what is called investigative journalism, sort of the long-term stories. Well, investigative journalism, if we're talking about the foreign policy of the United States, is going to take a long time to weed out corruption, a long time to weed out the bad behavior of our foreign policy officials, or war crimes, or any number of things. And because the media is conflict oriented, because they're focusing on things in the short run, then that in-depth coverage, that long-term coverage, has fallen by the wayside. We talked about this in the first lecture. Here's another couple of points to discuss regarding the government's attempt to manipulate the media. This is referred to as strategic communications, and this isn't just an attempt to manipulate the media. This is an attempt to manipulate foreign policy and the reactions of the nation states. Oftentimes, in an attempt to speak either to the public of other nation states or to the leaders of other nation states, our government uses the proxy of the media. And this is why our politicians oftentimes are so careful in what they say. Are not necessarily straightforward, not necessarily what we would consider straight shooters. That is because They're trying to shape a message, what they say to the public, how they answer a journalist question, so that a foreign leader or a foreign public gets the message too. And that's why they use careful language. That's why they parse different things. And oftentimes, this is why we see a repetition of officially sanctioned messages coming from political parties, coming from the government. The Daily Show used to do a very good representation of our politicians saying the same thing over and over and over again. Well, we may see that as spin, and it is, but it's not we, the public, who are trying to be spun. It's other nation states oftentimes that are trying to be spun. And so the government uses the media in order to communicate with other countries. Depending on your perspective, this can be considered propaganda. Propaganda oftentimes is seen as negative, and it is the use of false or misleading information designed to enhance a government's stature or policies. Well, why would we do such a thing? We would do such a thing in order to increase our perception of strength, in order to gain support from other nation states, and in order to deter other countries from acting. And so there is a strategic purpose for the government in spreading propaganda and lying to other nation states in order to protect our country. Well, this happens in foreign policy communications as well. Here we see different types of coverage. Rooftop journalism, we mentioned before, that's live breaking news coverage. It's very fast paced. It's people who are on the ground. But increasingly we see different variations of coverage that is not considered straight news on foreign policy stories. Sometimes stories come in soft news, and this is the presentation of public issues that is designed to entertain rather than to inform. There's a sense of sensationalism. They're covering the story because it's controversial. They're covering the story because there's a scandal. And it's not necessarily in depth. It is superficial. It doesn't necessarily move our foreign policy goals as a nation state forward, but it's more there for entertainment, and that's where we get this term infotainment from. And so there are any number of opinion shows, especially on cable news broadcasts at night, that engage in this constant coverage of things that is not just for information. It is for promoting a particular perspective, promoting a particular policy, but oftentimes there's sensationalism. You have people yelling at one another, so on and so forth. It's there to entertain as well. Infotainment can also be applied to the satirical news coverage that we see on late night television shows like The Daily Show, formerly The Colbert Report, but even the monologues of the late night comedians when they're covering politics, maybe when they're covering foreign policy, can and do shape people's opinions on what to think. And so we see that as being influential. There have been many studies, particularly about The Daily Show with Jon Stewart, about how the number of people getting their news or their information, particularly young people, was so great, rather than them getting it from traditional news sources. And one other thing that is changing the way that The media is covering stories, changing the way that uh, public opinion is shaped, and changing the way that people are gaining access to foreign policy stories is through internets and blogs. The main criticism of this is that people are engaging in selective perception. They're only seeking out those things that reinforce what they already believe. And the other major criticism is the accuracy of this information. Anybody can have a blog, anybody can set up a web page. Not everybody is going to be a good journalist, however. Not everybody is going to have access of professional journalism and have the judgment to, you know, back away from things that they can't prove. Oftentimes, in order to get someone's attention, you're going to say something inflammatory, even though you can't prove it. And we see that especially from electronic sources like the internet. And so we see the internet and blogs help to improve communications. We see it playing a key role in foreign policy stories. Twitter was very influential in the Arab Spring uprising in Egypt, for example. But the reliability of the information from these news sources is still questionable. Yet it's sort of changing the way that the media and journalism is being done.